Well, as I've already alluded to, one of the things I love about Christmas Eve is there is this group of people, some of whom are regulars, but some of whom I have never met before, and it's just wonderful to have so many guests coming from different backgrounds, from different convictions. If you are one of those guests, we are honored to have you with us tonight. And tonight, for just a few minutes, I'd like to consider with you the meaning of the stuff we've just been listening to as we've been hearing God's word read. I want to suggest that at the very heart of what we have been considering is the answer to a very important question. And that question is, does God speak? Now, I realize even by raising that, I'm already assuming something that maybe some of you don't agree with you. But I would ask that whatever your background, wherever you're coming from tonight, you would, at least for a moment, entertain with me the possibility that this world is not just a cosmic accident that just kind of came into existence on its own, but that there is someone who stands behind it, the one who made it. There is a God who rules over it. Some of you, maybe like me, are fans of, or at least have been fans of the musical Hamilton. I know this is now kind of so 5 years ago, but I still enjoy the musical from time to time. I used to listen to the soundtrack quite a bit, and there'd be a moment in listening to it that I would try to make sure I wasn't with the rest of my family, because my family, when I get emotional, they have a tendency to kind of mock me. And so there's this one point in the musical that gets me, like, every single time. It's if you know the musical, it's Quiet Uptown is the name of the song, and it's near the very end of Hamilton, and we're at a place where Hamilton's life is at a real low point. He has ruined his marriage by having an affair, and most recently, his and Eliza's son Philip, through a duel, died. And now he's in this moment where it feels like everything has fallen apart, and as he's singing, he is just trying to put the pieces together. He is absolutely wrecked by grief. He is humbled. He is, in some ways, a shell of the man he used to be, or at least he feels that way. And there's this moment about 2/3 of the way through the song where, see, I told you, it always gets me, even though I'm talking about a song. I mean, but there's this moment where Eliza, his wife, who has been so deeply wronged by him, takes him by the hand. And then there's like the cast in the background just sings the words, kind of almost with this awestruck sound, forgiveness. Can you imagine? And as I said, every single time it gets me. And you're asking me, why am I sharing that story right now? Well, I suppose one interpretation of what I've just described could be that all that I've just mentioned is just kind of an accident of evolution. That it's just something biology that's causing all of that. That in reality, there is no such thing as beautiful music. Beauty is just a construct of our brain. And there is nothing truly meaningful about a parent's love for their child. And that there is nothing truly tragic about a death, because that's just the way biology and evolution works. And there's nothing truly extraordinary about a wife who has been so deeply wronged forgiving her husband. But I hope you can understand why I would come to a different conclusion. That even this somewhat small scene is just one of thousands of windows into a reality where we see beauty and where tragedy points us and where love points us to something bigger, to a mystery that is beyond anything that we can stick under a microscope or experiment on, that there is something vast that we cannot name. And I hope you can understand that if I believe that there is this bigger reality than anything we can taste or touch, why I would also conclude that there is someone who stands behind it all, one who made both what we can see and what we can't. And so I'm asking you to entertain with me that possibility. And as you do, I want to continue to ask this question. Does God, does this one who has made all things, speak? Can you see why that would be an important question? If there is really someone who has made all of this, who is the one behind beauty, goodness, truth, love, wouldn't it be good to know who he is? Wouldn't it be good to hear him tell us about himself and maybe even tell us about us? It would seem that anything he would have to say would be important. It could also be uncomfortable, because if this God tells us about ourselves, we might see us through his eyes, and that might be unsettling. But even as scary as that might be, wouldn't we want to hear God if he speaks? So does God speak? I know some would say, no, I really don't think he does. At least he hasn't spoken to me. I remember a number of years ago, I was talking to someone who'd had a very hard life, far harder than anything I've experienced. And we were talking, actually, about Christianity. And he said, I tried the Christian thing for a while. And I prayed, and I asked God for help, and he never answered. He doesn't speak. I mean, some might say, if God were actually to decide to talk to us, wouldn't it be obvious? Wouldn't it be something that everyone was certain of, maybe in some just enormously loud voice with fireworks and trumpets and fanfare, so that no one is left in doubt? If God spoke to us, wouldn't it be awesome? Wouldn't it be clear to us? Well, maybe. But it does take a kind of arrogance, doesn't it, to assume that we know the God who's so far beyond us, that we know how he would speak to us. What if this God, who is, again, beyond anything we can understand, chooses or chose to speak in a different fashion? What if the reason that we don't feel like God spoke, or at least didn't speak to us, is because we have spent our time looking for him to speak in one way, and all this time he has spoken, but in an entirely different fashion, and we just missed it? Let me ask the question in a different way. How could God speak to us? If God were to want to talk to us and tell us about himself and about things, how would he speak to us? That might not seem like a hard question to answer, but think about it. This God is way beyond us. How could he, who's so far beyond us, who stands outside of time and space, somehow make himself known to us? Many years ago, in our backyard, we kind of had this planet Earth moment of wildlife. There was a ferocious cat who was finding a chipmunk, and in that moment, it wasn't really the clash of the titans. It was clear who was going to win. And one of our sons, who was really disconcerted by the injustice of this moment, came and sought to intervene and was able to scare the cat away and rescue the chipmunk, and the chipmunk, so filled with gratitude, bit him. Which I suppose makes sense. Thankfully, he didn't break the skin, didn't have to get rabies shots, all was right. But if you think about it, though my son was at the time, I think, 5 years old, to this chipmunk, he was a hulking Godzilla monster, right? And even if he had said something like, "Don't worry, it's okay, I'm on your side, I'm just protecting you," that's not what the chipmunk would have heard. It would have sounded like a roar to the chipmunk. The only way that the chipmunk could ever have been okay is if somehow my son could have almost shrunk himself and maybe learn to speak chipmunk. The only way really, I think, to have made the chipmunk feel okay is if my son could somehow become a chipmunk to that chipmunk, right? Now, as much of a difference as there is between my son and the chipmunk, and it's enormous, it is far less than the difference between us and God. The one who is infinite, eternal, who stands, again, outside of time. He has always been, no matter how far back you go, he has always been. He holds all things in his hands. He is so far beyond us. And if that's the case, how in the world can this God, who is so great, speak to us in a way that would not utterly terrify us and melt us? John, one of Jesus' apostles, seeks to answer that very question for us. In the very beginning of the Gospel of John, as he is reflecting on the things that we've been talking about tonight, as he reflects on the birth of Jesus, in a simple verse, he contains something too extraordinary for us to ever fully comprehend. He says, "And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us." When he's talking about the Word, he's talking about the Son of God. The Son of God who, for all eternity, lived in loving fellowship with God the Father by the power of the Spirit. I realize I'm speaking of things beyond our understanding, but what he's saying is that God himself, God's Son, entered into this world by becoming a crying little baby, taking on human flesh, experiencing weakness, experiencing all that we experience. That's how God came to us. It is what the Christians call the doctrine of the incarnation, and it is a mystery. There is a poem that tries to help us to hear it by Lucy Shaw. She writes, "Down he came from up, and in from out, and here from there. A long leap, an incandescent fall from magnificent to naked, frail, small. Through space between stars into our chill night air shrunk in infant grace to our damp, cramped, earthly place among all the shivering sheep. And now, after all, there he lies, fast asleep." We're speaking of something that no matter how much we try, we will never understand. It is not something to be explained. It is a mystery that can only be received. But what I want us to just reflect on for just a moment longer is that when John is telling us what happened, the way he speaks of the eternal Son of God is as the Word. That is, that when Jesus came into this world and became a child, he was God speaking. That God knows that the only way we can truly hear, that we could truly understand, is if he shrunk himself down into a baby and became one of us, that we might know. When we look at Jesus, that is God speaking to us in his coming, in his life, his death, his resurrection. God is speaking. He is declaring to us, this is who I am. Do you want to know me? Do you want to know your Creator? Look at Jesus. This is me. And in the way that he came, the strange, confusing way of speech that so few recognized, he was declaring to us why he came. When he came to a peasant girl in the middle of nowhere in weakness as a baby, God was showing us that he had come to stoop down lower than we possibly can imagine. That he was coming to rescue even us, and even through death, to lift us into life. When Jesus came, God was declaring to us his love for this world and his love for you. He was declaring his mercy and his forgiveness to all who turn to him. Forgiveness. Can you imagine? This is why we gather tonight. This is why we will sing in just a moment's time, "Joy to the world. The Lord is come. Let earth receive her King. Let every heart prepare him room, and heaven and nature sing."